I'm a very big fan of bridges and networks and all of those things. I get to work with Prevention Network, and Prevention Network is designed to also cover some of those gaps between our grassroots groups and the state and the national and the regional efforts for prevention, SUD prevention, as well as just overall health. But our focus is substance misuse prevention. And so when we're talking about capacity building and talking about what we're trying to accomplish with this coalition support capacity building program, we really are working to build up our workforce, to build up the system and the network of support that we have for our workforce and our coalition volunteers, to be able to really equip our communities to build momentum as we go for prevention. We know that there's additional funding coming down the pipeline for opioid settlements. We recognize that there's increased federal funding to address some vaping to help prevent overdose, and there will continue to be funding available. And while funding is part of our capacity and oftentimes a limiting factor, we also want to make sure that we have the training, the skills, the knowledge, and the connections, those relationships, to really make the most of the funding that is available when it becomes available. So the Coalition Support Community Change Program is working on developing capacity at those levels. And tonight, like I said, we're focused on youth engagement. So January 19th, 2022, my name is Ruth Schwindinger. You can reach me at ruths@preventionnetwork.org and the phone number on the screen. If you need that later, let me know and I can put it in the chat box as well. I really want to get started thinking about reminding us, trying to get into the shoes of youth. And so I have a question for you, and this is going to be an interactive part, and if you want to, you can put it in the chat box. But what is that step? What is it that signals that change from when someone is a youth to when they become an adult? Is there a singular event? Is it automatically when you turn 18? What is it? And I want us to recognize that it's different in different cultures. It's different in different settings. So what are some of those things that have signaled to you that I'm no longer dealing with a child, I'm now addressing an adult?
I'll speak to that. I don't think sometimes they could still be at a child age, and I'll use myself for an example. Child age but an adult position. So I was a teenage mother. So even though I was a child, I had to be addressed and dealt with some of my issues on an adult level.
When you take responsibility for another human being, when you are their primary caregiver, that is absolutely one of those things that can signify we're dealing with an adult, right? And I mean, it could be that 18 years age, I've passed a certain date and I'm ready to go. It could be I've physically bested my father at something, right? I can finally overcome in that situation. Or it could be a sexual experience that someone has accomplished or experienced a certain sexual experience and now they look at themselves as an adult. It could be a 21 age birthday, right? There are a lot of different things that we can look at that signify adulthood. It could be getting a full-time job. It could be, like in Wanda's situation, becoming a caregiver. And sometimes when we're dealing with youth in very difficult situations, that happens at an incredibly young age. I have a friend who became primary caregiver for her brothers and sisters when she was 9 years old. And it was not legally recognized, but she was the responsible adult in that household. And so when we're talking about youth engagement, typically in prevention, we're talking about a specific age range of, 12 to 17 or thereabouts, and that's clearly defined. What's not clearly defined often is how youth view themselves. So the students in our programs, the young people that we're working with, do they view themselves as adults? And that's a really important factor to consider as we're engaging youth. I had some good conversations with Dawn Flood earlier this month. And Dawn is a program coordinator with Student Leadership Solutions. And so I've based a lot of our conversation tonight about that, those things that we covered with Dawn. But I wanted us to consider and just kind of put ourselves in that mindset of what was it in my life that signaled adulthood? What was it for me when I started thinking of myself as an adult? How old was I? And I wonder if anybody has a personal response to that. And if you don't, that's okay. But I do want you to think about that, even if you don't share it with me.
Yeah, Ruth, if I could just say, I was thinking that actually, I used to think like 18 was the, kind of time you start to vote, you're considered an adult. But now I think in many cases, people are not really taking on the role of an adult until later. I would say early 20s or mid 20s even. And I would say the financial independence and living on your own, providing for yourself would be a big factor in that.
Yeah, I agree.
I strongly agree with that. As a person that was that myself, I was a person in foster care, and I stayed in the system until I transitioned into adulthood on my own. And in the state of Indiana, you were considered to be on your own at age 18, but what bridged that gap for me tremendously was college. And I think that that reflects back to the previous commenter's statement that kids maybe turn 18 and often they're still 21 and 22 while they're in college or graduate school, but they haven't taken on the responsibility of living on their own totally and being responsible for themselves totally financially. And I think that mark is the true reflection of adulthood, when you can take on total financial responsibility for yourself in society.
I think that that's definitely a key, and I would agree with you that that level of personal responsibility is what marks adulthood. And we can define that in different ways, whether you're taking responsibility for another human, if you're taking financial responsibility, or if you're just taking responsibility for your decisions, and accepting that you're responsible for those decisions and those outcomes and the consequences, positive or negative. And I think a willingness to take responsibility, for me, definitely shows maturation, but it can also delineate adulthood from youth. And so when we're talking about youth, I just wanted us to have that context of what is it that we're talking about, and is it the same thing that other people are talking about? So when you're talking about having a youth coalition or engaging youth members in your existing coalitions and task forces, it's important to define those terms as you're using them, because we all come at that from a different background with different experience, and recognize that there are 10-year-olds that I trust more than some 30-year-olds, because they are willing to take that responsibility for their actions and for the consequences of their actions. And so recognizing that age should not be a limiting factor. And so I want to also point out that everything we talk about tonight is also relevant for adults. So when we're talking about youth engagement, one of the first things we need to do is intentionally create the space for them to engage. And so when we're talking about, creating the space, we're not talking just about the physical space, because right now, many things are still virtual. But when we're creating a space, we need to have people have the opportunity to engage. We need to have different levels of involvement for people to walk in and say, you know, I can show up 5 minutes early and help set up tables and chairs. I can come in and make the Kool-Aid. I can come in, you know, not be there on time because of the way my bus schedule is, but I can be there a little bit later and help clean up. You can have somebody who wants to help create calendars and meeting links and notes. You can have somebody who wants to take minutes at your meetings. You can have somebody who's willing to follow up with people who are not there and help with attendance and accountability on that part. There's a lot of different opportunities for people to engage, and age, again, is not a limiting factor. But specifically for people who are less confident in how they're going to engage with your groups, with your coalitions, we need to be intentional about offering them that opportunity to identify something that they would be comfortable with. The second thing here is safe space. When we're creating the space, it has to be safe. When we're talking about creating opportunities for people to engage, and that's what coalitions are, is about building relationships and allowing people to join in on a shared mission. People need to feel safe. And oftentimes, when we're talking about the impact that COVID has had on schools, that safe space has been destroyed. People don't feel as safe at home sometimes as they do in school. Oftentimes that structure provides people with encouragement and comfort. And so that space needs to be structured. It needs to be physically safe. It needs to be emotionally safe. And so when we're setting up those ground rules for any group, we want to be clear about what the expectations are as far as respect. I will respect you. I will expect you to respect other members and other people who contribute to this group. We will respect the space that we're in by putting things back to the way we found them, if that's the expectation. But that safe space extends to, like I said, emotional safety, so that we're not judging people, but we're providing them positive feedback and encouragement. We're talking about safety. The next level on that, when we're talking about what people need, is really about recognizing those multiple dimensions of health. Because beyond the bare minimum of needing to be safe, we want people to also be healthy. And so I want to share with you, how many people are familiar with the 8 dimensions? Sam says 8 dimensions of health. So the 8 dimensions of wellness. One of the things I like to do when I'm engaging with people for the first time, if it's going to be an in-depth conversation, if it's going to be an in-depth, long-lasting relationship where I have any measure of authority, whether it's a supervisory role, administrative role, or just like a mentorship role, I really want to encourage people to recognize that their physical wellness is one part of their whole well-being. And so we're talking about the 8 dimensions of wellness. That includes and encompasses emotional wellness, spiritual wellness, intellectual well-being, our physical health, environmental, which would be that safe space, financial well-being, our occupational, or when we're talking about young people, oftentimes that can be school-related development, and then our social well-being. So I'm planning on sharing some different documents that you can use to do some assessments for the 8 dimensions of wellness. And I'm going to do that just in in the chat box, and then I'll share them later. But I would encourage every once in a while for those people that are relying on you for leadership to help them do a self-assessment here on maybe a semi-annual basis that helps them identify what they're doing well. And this is just kind of an assessment that's available. I think it's from the Health and Wellness Services at University of Colorado. And so it's really helpful just as a check-in so that people can recognize what's helpful and what's not, as well as our responsibility as prevention workers is to really consistently focus on our health and well-being as well, because we can't lead others, we can't take care of others well if we're not taking care of ourselves. And so it's important for us to recognize where we have room for improvement, and encourage others to continue in that process of self-assessment and recognize that we all have room for growth and we all have room for improvement. So I did put those in the chat, and I hope that you're able to use those. If you have questions, let me know. So I just wanted to offer that as a resource. Recognize that overall health and well-being is important. After we've created the bare minimum level of a safe space, the next level of encouraging growth and encouraging healthy relationships is to consider all of those different levels of health. And I already talked about levels of involvement. You're going to know that you're successful in creating the space when your participants feel accepted, respected, and understood. So it's always good, in my opinion, to be seeking feedback and welcoming feedback on how did things go today. If you've got somebody that sticks around after a meeting, how did things go today? What was your take on such and such conversation? Make sure you provide opportunity for feedback. Oftentimes, people who are less confident, our young people, are less likely to speak out in an official meeting. And so we want to create those opportunities for them to provide feedback, for them to engage, that are not always upfront and vocal in a meeting, or in that face-to-face opportunity for connection. You want to provide them with your contact information, and make sure that you provide one-to-one check-ins with youth, but never be in a situation where their safety or your safety is in question. So a general rule of thumb is never be in a private one-on-one situation with a young person, and that will just protect both of you. So that you're going to want to be travel in groups of threes, so that there's always somebody, a third person there as a witness in case there should be accusations of anything untoward happening. It's also helpful, not just with that in mind, it's also helpful to have another person there just so they can share perspective and understanding, because like we all come from different backgrounds, we all have a different understanding of and a different interpretation of events. Even if we all experience the same event, our perspective is different. So we need to make sure that people feel accepted for who they are, so that they will feel safe enough to engage in the next steps of the program. We want to make sure that they feel respected. If they're feeling respected, then they're more likely to engage. And that goes for young people, that goes for adults, that goes for everybody. So if someone feels respected in how they're treated, if you create that space for them to be heard, and then do your best to show that you can understand them, then they will be able to engage more effectively. So accepted, respected, and understood. And you can just check in with your participants on that and say, how did it go today? Did you get anything out of it? So one of the best things that we can do when we're talking to engaging youth is ask questions. And Dawn encouraged us to ask, what do you feel is worth changing? And that was the question that got her engaged in youth development and youth prevention. What do you feel is worth changing? And when we're asking that, we don't want to just go with the basic level of knee-jerk reaction of, well, I think people should be nicer to each other. Okay, take it another level, ask the next step, why do you feel that way? And once you get to the root cause of what is worth changing, you want to follow that up and empower youth by asking, how can you change that? How can you have an impact on that element in your community that needs changing? And you can help them develop, you can coach them through that, you can ensure that people have opportunity to be heard, you can workshop those problems. What you don't want to do is start giving people answers, especially when you're working with youth, because that's what we call adultism, is when you ask the question and you provide the answer and then you provide the plan. Purpose in engaging youth is to develop leaders, is to be immediately responsive to their cultural needs. So we need to avoid answering the questions. And sometimes we need to avoid asking the questions, but to let those conversations develop on their own. And for me, that takes a great amount of patience, because the more experienced you are in dealing with SUD prevention or with any specific topic, the more experienced you are, the easier it is for you to find solutions. But our goal is not for Ruth to provide the solutions. Our goal is for us to build community capacity, for us to build the momentum as a community. And that includes building the individual capacity of our members, of the youth that are involved. So we really need to be asking these questions and providing the space for them to answer. And then we need to be able to give them what they're asking for. If we're asking, what do you feel is worth changing? How could you change that? And what do you need to accomplish that? We need to work with them to get the equipment or to get the resources or to get the training they need to be able to do those things. And that is just being invested. So if you don't have the time to invest in developing the young people who are participating in this, you're not the right person for that job. Get other people who are passionate about working with youth, get other people who are already familiar with the situation, who already have a good relationship with those young people, get them involved. Anytime you ask a question, you need to listen. Is everybody with me so far? I feel like this is really, really basic stuff, right? Ask the question, create the environment, and listen to the response. When we're asking the questions, that will create space for people to feel heard. When we're asking the questions, it can be really difficult in a group setting. Because of those group dynamics, we often have people who will dominate conversations. I'm one of those, especially if I feel comfortable in it. So when we're talking about a group dynamic and asking questions, oftentimes you need to step back as a facilitator in that group and look at those people who may not be engaging. And it's really easy to see who's engaging or not because of their body language, because of their facial expression, because of their focus. What is their focus on? Is it on the conversation? Is it on whoever's speaking at the moment? And so when you're encouraging people to engage in conversations and you're encouraging them to consider the answers to those questions of what's important to you, what do you think we can change? We really need to pay attention and engage those people and create the space. And sometimes that means shutting certain people down for a moment and asking them to step back. And you can do that in very tactful ways of I think that's a great point. I would like to hear what so-and-so's thoughts are, right? Anytime we're dealing with people who have less confidence, and I keep saying that because it's not always youth. Sometimes there are youth that are incredibly confident and they just need some additional skills and some additional opportunities to develop those leadership skills. When we're talking with people who may be less confident, we need to give them the opportunity to respond in individual and group settings and in written ways. And so a lot of facilitating youth engagement is follow up and follow up and follow up. So ask those questions. And this next point I have on multiple slides. And it just says avoid leading. So Sarah, I'm going to call you out for a minute. What do you think I mean by avoid leading?
I'm going to say it's if you're asking a question, sometimes the way you phrase it or something, you're kind of leading them to give you the response you're kind of looking for, or just the way you present certain things. Because in your own mind as the adult, you might already be trying to drive the group to go towards something that maybe you want to have and not have the skills to just listen to the youth come up with their own ideas.
Marcel, have you ever been in a situation where you already have the solution before they've identified the problem?
Yeah, that's happened before. And what I try and do though is be sort of in the background. So I usually try and appoint a member of the youth group to kind of lead the group and ask the questions and so forth, so that I don't do that.
It is the most difficult thing to do as an adult, to watch people struggle and suffer and go through things that you could prevent that suffering and you could prevent that struggle. But that is how growth happens, right? And it's not always about pain and suffering. Oftentimes it's about just that learning experience. But we have to be patient. We have to give them the opportunities to figure it out on their own, because that builds confidence. That builds their ability to address their problems that they've identified, and it builds leaders. It really does. And so oftentimes what I see in coalitions is one person takes the leadership and they're competent and they're confident and they're capable of addressing all of these problems and they have the answers. But other people don't engage. They don't jump on board. They don't participate in implementing the solutions, because they didn't help identify the problem. They didn't help find the solutions. They don't have that buy-in. Kiara, you're looking very responsive. Do you have thoughts on that experience, maybe? You can say no comment. That's all right too. I tend to put people on the spot sometimes.
You still talking about leading, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that I don't remember who said it, but that can definitely happen. You kind of probe the youth to like answer it in the way you want them to answer it, instead of allowing them to kind of work through it themselves. So definitely should try to avoid doing that when you can.
Thank you. Yes, we need to avoid it. And some people are very expressive. I think Chris has a good poker face, but I've been told from a very young age that my eyebrows give everything away. And so I have to monitor my facial expression. I have to monitor my tone, because I'm a very upfront person. If I'm feeling a certain way, you're going to know it. And if I feel like somebody's coming up with bad ideas, I'll tend to shut them down. And oftentimes I don't consider, and I need to be more considerate of other people's feelings, especially when I'm dealing with people who are maybe less confident. And so when we're talking about working with youth, our primary objective is to encourage them That is it. We need to encourage them and equip them for the future. So my background, I've been trained in the psychoeducational model. We refer to it just simply as PEM, and we used it specifically to for behavioral management, to train young people to change their behavior. And there's a ratio in PEM of 8 positive, encouraging interactions for every 1 corrective action. And that produces the best results. So especially if we're dealing with youth who have been through difficult times, who are living currently in a disadvantaged situation, we want to encourage them 8 times for every 1 time we offer a correction. And you have to couch that correction in terms of, this is very specifically what you can do, and you can help them identify the consequences of their behavior that was needing to be changed. And we always, always, always need to separate the behavior from the young person. Because when we're talking about dealing with young people, oftentimes they will internalize and personalize any correction as a condemnation of themselves. And when our primary objective in youth engagement is to encourage and build up the youth, we have to be very careful about any correction, and so that can be something that is communicated with our body language, our facial expression, and our tone. One of the things I hear from youth most is that people are always talking down to me. They interrupt me. They don't think I'm picking up on, that patronizing tone or that sarcasm. And that's hurtful. And so when we are creating this space and we're asking those questions and we're listening to the responses, you have to listen to be able to understand. We're not listening to be able to respond with an answer. When we're working with youth engagement, we're listening to understand. And oftentimes that includes a rephrasing of, this is what I understand you're saying. Is that right? Can you help me understand? Can you define that? Can you explain that a little bit further? Can you give me an example of what you've experienced that makes you feel that way? And so when we're talking about youth engagement and we're talking about creating that space for people to be safe initially, creating that space for people to develop their own health and well-being using those 8 dimensions of wellness, we're talking about asking the questions and allowing them to define what they are feeling capable of changing. We're talking about listening to be able to understand. And when we're listening and we ask those follow-up questions, oftentimes people are going to say, I don't know. I just heard it somewhere. That's not an acceptable response. And so when we're asking these questions with the intent to develop leaders, with the intent to increase our understanding, we want to ask those questions and ask follow-up questions so that they can develop those critical thinking skills, so that they can develop that perspective. Because that is one thing that you can't overcome as a young person, is that lack of perspective, that lack of experience, is understanding. Oftentimes around that 12 to 13-year-old age, people will expand their understanding of the world is more than just me and those around me. I have an obligation to my culture. I have an obligation to my family. I have an obligation to whatever other groups I'm a part of, and I identify myself with. I can identify with all of these other larger groups, and I have an obligation to understand what they are, understand their values, and live out those values in my life. So when we're asking these questions, we need to recognize that oftentimes those questions are going to lead to more questions. Never plan a youth event with something immediately afterward. You always need to have time afterward for follow-up. You always need to have time afterward to engage and respond to those questions. The next step is to just continue coaching. So after we've created that space, we've asked and encouraged the youth to ask questions, we've listened to responses, and they know what's next. We're going to continue by developing those skills that they need to implement their solutions. It may be writing a speech, it may be peer mentoring, it may be talking to their legislators, it may be advocating to their parents to start talking about, changing the norms on youth drinking. Whatever it is, our job as coalition experts, our job as coalition leaders is to help our members, whether they're youth members or adult members, to have that ongoing skills development. So, hi, Rebecca. What are some of those skills that you feel or you have helped equip people to develop in your coalition, in your groups? So what are some of those ongoing skills that we all need to constantly cultivate?
Public speaking.
Public speaking.
Eye contact with communication, especially with adults.
Contact is one of those things that sometimes in different cultures means different things. And we have to be careful about being confrontational or being avoidant with our eye contact. There should be a comfortable gaze there, which I have not yet figured out with Zoom. So if it looks like I'm looking off in the corner, I'm trying to make eye contact with somebody, I promise.
We also work with ours a lot on following through.
Yeah, just follow through. And like I said, most of your time is going to be spent following up, making sure people are doing the things they say they're going to do. Because if you do it yourself, then you're not equipping the leaders to do it. It might be faster, it might be easier for you to do the work yourself, but training people how to follow through is important. What about time management? And time management's one of them that a lot of adults still struggle with as well.
And being dependable and reliable, keeping your word. If you say you're going to be somewhere and do something, and the importance of knowing when they don't show up, how it affects the whole team. So being reliable and dependable.
And again, that might look different in different situations. So depending on your values, it might be more important to show up and give somebody a ride. If you saw their car broken down or their vehicle broken down, maybe it's more important for you to be there for that person than to be at a meeting. Maybe they are being reliable, but it looks different because they value one over another. And so anytime we're working with people, we need to be practicing grace, especially right now during COVID, when there's additional stress, there's additional conflict, there's additional worry, and additional challenges as far as engaging with people. So one of the things that I find really difficult is, especially working with young people, is helping them understand that other people have had different experiences. And so I'm an ally of individuals in recovery, and I've been to several recovery meetings. And one of the things I like is that people share their stories. And when people are brave and able to share their stories, I gain an understanding. I gain perspective. And so when we're talking about engaging youth, we want to, of course, have that safe space. We want to have those ground rules that show respect for people, and maybe showing up on time is one of those things. And communicating with whoever's facilitating if you're not going to be there. So follow up, make sure you get the notes, make sure you know what's next. but helping people have those opportunities that you're going to give them the opportunity to share a story, to share their perspective, and to hear from other people who have a different perspective. That's really valuable when we're developing leaders, especially young people, when we're talking about middle and high school youth. Help them gain a better perspective. And you can do that through videos, you can do that through speakers, you can do that through a variety of different ways, encouraging them to read, read things that were created years ago or by different cultures. But one of the values in coaching people is to continuously educate ourselves. And so when we're educating ourselves, we need to recognize that our education system was designed to help us learn how to learn. Yes, there's a basic set of knowledge and a basic set of skills that we all should have. But if we've been successful and we at school, then we know how to keep learning. We know how to investigate. We know how to find the answers to what we're looking for. And so you are constantly modeling for those around you, and your behavior, your attitudes, your reactions, especially when you're working with young people, they pick up on every little thing. You have an audience. They do see what you're doing. They do recognize your values. They do recognize that when you are humble enough to recognize that I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm going to find out. That is an incredibly valuable coaching moment for the young people that you're working with. And just encourage them to continuously try learning. And that's a good life experience. That goes back to the Sam says 8 dimensions of wellness. Continue to challenge yourself, continue to learn new things. So, Karen, you've been awfully quiet so far. How can you avoid leading when we're talking about coaching?
For me, it's just a lot of patience, a lot of listening. When I spend more of my time not so much like interacting with youth as I do with interacting with the community in general and with parents, and getting them to recognize what our young people need from us as adults, and what that looks like and what that doesn't look like, kind of thing. Because I think sometimes as adults, we're on one track moving full steam ahead, and we forget that our kids are not moving at the same speed we are. And if we don't stop to recognize what they need, we kind of pass them by, so to speak. And just, for me, it just means, like I said, a lot of patience, a lot of listening, a lot of asking questions, more probing questions, asking, what they mean when they say things, just making sure that they have a voice and that they know they're being heard. Because you're talking about like our education system and the way that it's designed and stuff like that. I mean, it is very much designed in a way that, there's a structure to it, and we are telling kids, what they do, what they need to do, when they need to do it, and how they need to do it. So we're conditioning them to believe that how they think, how they feel, what they need doesn't matter, or that comes secondary. So then all of a sudden when they're teenagers and we're trying to engage them, that engagement isn't readily there. We have to really work to make them believe that, and not just to make them believe that sounds kind of self-serving and kind of false, but we have to make them realize that their voices matter, and that how valuable they are. And that takes a lot of work.
It really does. It takes a lot of mentoring. It takes a lot of examples. It takes a lot of praise. And so when we're talking about that 8-to-1 ratio of praise and correction, you can't overpraise a person, a young person. If you are giving them genuine compliments, if you are being specific about what they're doing well and the impact it's having on those around them, that's really important. That, like I said, encouraging them to be engaged is the most important thing we can do. And it's challenging. You said you're working primarily with adults in the community, and getting them to recognize what the youth needs are. Are you able to work with youth to teach them to advocate for themselves, to voice their own needs, to help them recognize these questions of what do you feel is worth changing and how could you change that? What do you need to accomplish that?
Yeah, to a certain degree, I am. For our council, I have made sure that we've kind of made a shift to get our council to realize that we need to start working with teens more often. They're our next group of parents. So many of the coalitions that I work with parents and doing parenting groups and parenting classes and seeing the high need that's there. And I've tried to kind of push that shift to why don't we start working more with our youth and giving them the tools that they're going to need as parents. So then when they are parents, they're more equipped to handle the needs of their family and the needs of their children, and find out from our youth what it is that they want and what it is that they need. And for the first time, because when we do our work plan, we also look at like community needs assessments in our area, and they're all done with adults. And so finally this year I said, I want to do something that is more, comes from youth more. We do a lot of surveys with our kids in schools, and they're very specific questions with yes, no answers. And so I was able to work with a large group of students over at our Career Tech Center who helped me design a survey that all of the students at the Career Tech Center took. And it was basically just asking, what is it that you want to tell adults that you need? That's kind of where we started out. I told them, you guys take a lot of surveys, you answer very pointed questions. What are those surveys not asking you? What else, if you take those survey, like what thought are you left with? I would like people, adults to know this about my needs. And they had a lot of really good questions they came up with, a lot of great input that we were able to pull together into the survey. And as it turned out, the ISD and all the local school districts who were involved through the ISD, it was a really eye-opening experience for them, because they were like, we did not know the kids felt that way. And there's now a lot of discussion on repeating the survey as time goes on, trying to use it to better meet the needs of the students, to get them the resources that they need, the resources they're asking for. And I kind of approached it with, we can think that we know what kids need, but we don't know until they tell us themselves. So, those are kind of more of the ways, like I wish I could work with kids in, youth groups and one-on-one and stuff like that. But I try to grab every opportunity that I can to pull youth into whatever we're doing and try to give them their voice. And hopefully it catches on over time with in other areas.
Absolutely. Wanda, did you have something you wanted to share?
I was listening to you, Karen, and I think that's very important, because as we said in the beginning, with different cultures, different households, everything varies. So you have some people that grow up in homes and they're not even allowed to do that. So for me to say how I feel or to express myself, I'm talking back, I'm being disrespectful. So for some people, they really are developing. So it's really helping them to pull that voice out because it's not even something that they were allowed to do. So it's suppressed a lot of times. So you get children that's scared to open up because they were taught in the home. It's disrespectful. You're rude. You don't do that. You don't say that. Or I'm talking. So even when I hear parents do that, I'm like, oh my goodness, they're shutting that child down.
Yeah.
So I think that's awesome that that's recognized.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love that. I love the encouragement that you're getting there, Wanda, from to Karen. I appreciate that too. I think I would just second what you said. That's valuable. When we're talking about equipping people, we're talking about recognizing that we want to do this also in just kind of a trauma-informed way. And I'm not saying that as a buzzword, but to recognize that we are all dealing with something right now that may be potentially traumatic for some people. We recognize that the intense disruption of what's happened in our schools over the last year and a half, 2 years, has really thrown a wrench in a lot of people's plans. We recognize that there's going to be delays in that educational development, in those accomplishments, and to change our expectations so that we recognize that maybe there are some basic needs that are not being met right now. But one of my favorite sayings is something I actually pulled off the wall from an old colleague. Liz Leach was an emergency services provider with our Community Mental Health Services Association, and she had a sign on her wall that she gave me when she retired, and it said, "What people really need is a good listening to." And I love that. People need to be listened to. When we're equipping them and we're encouraging them to be leaders, which we are, we need to give them the opportunities to make those choices for themselves. In addition to listening, we need to help them to overcome whatever barriers are happening in their life right now by making choices. And when we are dealing with people who are in a potentially traumatic situation, giving them a choice, whether it's a simple choice of, do you want, red Kool-Aid or blue, empowering them to make those choices can help them through that potentially traumatic situation. So beyond that, when they start making those choices and we are equipping them and affirming those choices, and encouraging them to continue making those choices for themselves and others around them, it may have no consequence to you whatsoever what color Kool-Aid you bring to the youth coalition. But for that person, they now have buy-in. They now have some investment. They made that decision. And once people have a small little scrap of a corner of the piece of decision making, they feel more involved. And so we talked about those different levels of involvement, give people different levels and different ways they can be involved. Equip each one of them, encourage each one of them to make a choice that affects everybody else. It doesn't have to be a big choice. When you create that space and you are working to develop leaders and you're encouraging them, you need to engage them and consult them on some of those things as well. But don't do it in a patronizing way. If somebody says, "I don't care what kind of Kool-Aid we have, you choose," then you choose. That's their choice. They've made that decision, right? Honor that decision. Don't pigeonhole people. Offer them a wide opportunity to make choices. And remember that you're modeling by example in all of these things. If you're coaching people, you are a role model. They are going to watch what you're doing a little bit more closely. So watch for yourself, watch what you're doing. And make sure that you're doing a good job of setting the example of how to respect people, of how to not interrupt, of how to create space for people to be heard. Anybody want to take a guess at what I think is the hardest part of working with young people? Hardest part. Anybody want to take a guess? What do you think, Lauren?
Maybe getting them to engage with you or step up to be leaders.
Maybe. That's a good guess. I like sitting down with people and joining them where they're at and doing whatever they're doing. So I usually don't try to get them to engage with me. I usually engage them where they're at. Whether it's in the hallway, they're working on their math before I'll sit down next to them and say, oh, what's that problem? Are you struggling? I'm good with math. I'm good with numbers. Allie, do you have any guesses? What's the hardest part of working with young people? You're in a time of transition, just as a clue. It has to do with transitions.
Oh, well, I'm not sure about that, but what was on my mind is that when you're dealing with kids, you can put in all the effort and stuff, but then they go home and their families display certain behaviors or they live a certain type of way. So I feel like it kind of contradicts what we're doing, and it can be hard. It can definitely be a barrier. And youth as their family and their life at home.
That is so heartbreaking when you put all the effort and energy into building someone up and they go home and one word destroys all that confidence that you built up. That is not what I was thinking of, but that is definitely a hard thing to deal with because you are one person. When we're talking about helping people overcome their environments, I would encourage you to consider yourself as the light. We already talked about your role model. You are a light in a dark place, and that is a really easy thing to be because it doesn't take much light to overcome the darkness, and you can do that. So even if they go home to a situation that is mentally and verbally abusive, and they go home to a situation where they have no control, where they are criticized for thinking for themselves, you've already created that opportunity. You've already shown them what they can be. You've created that space for them. Maybe they don't have that space at home, but you've created that space for them. The hardest part for me, and this is different for other people, the hardest part is saying goodbye. When they move on, when they graduate, when they move on to the next step in their life, the next phase in their life, that's the hardest part for me. And so we're talking about building and engaging youth. We recognize that youth looks different in different conditions, in different settings for different people. Dawn and her executive director have a saying. Pam Voss Page said, and I hope I get this right, we are most effective, we're at our best when we're not even there. And so when you have done a successful job of equipping and encouraging a young person to be a leader, to engage in their community, they're going to continue doing that even when their community changes. So when they move on, when they find themselves in a different situation, if you're able to keep in touch, you want to encourage them to continue in that leadership role, to continue to educate themselves and engage in different ways in their community, even if their community changes. You want to encourage them to educate younger students. If they found themselves being passionate about anything, encourage them to share that passion with other people if it's a healthy thing. Right? If it's a healthy coping mechanism, or if it's a learning style, or if it's a particular study in school or a topic, class. Encourage them to share that passion with other people, younger students especially. And then finally, just maintain that relationship because it helps you to stay encouraged. If you have people who have graduated through your programs, or even if it's not a specific program, but they've grown and learned and developed that relationship, don't let it end because they've hit a certain age mark. Don't let it end just because they're living in a different community. Social media has made it really easy to stay connected, and so you want to watch those professional barriers. You don't want to have a social media relationship with somebody that is separate from your professional relationship. So if you have a professional relationship with a young person, you need to consistently monitor and have healthy boundaries there. But you can continue that professional relationship after they've moved on. And that will encourage you just to see their continued success. It will encourage them to have someone who can serve as a mentor. And they can serve as an example, or they can come back and visit that youth coalition or the youth members and encourage and share those positive stories of how what you're doing has had an impact on their life because you were able to be that point of light, because you were able to equip them, because you created the space for them to be heard and respected and understood.